Today we are finishing our unit on pre-modern Africa by talking about Africa in the Middle Ages. So, starting with trade in the Sahara, the trans-Saharan trade route. The Sahara Desert, biggest desert in the world, absolutely massive, way larger than most countries. Trade across this desert increased dramatically with the arrival of Islamic merchants in the 8th century. Remember, that's the 700s. So in the 700s, when Muslims came to Africa here, you have them increasing trade in the region. And the animal that they used to transport goods were camels. Why? Well, camels can go a very long time without water. They can store many gallons inside of them and can go a very long time without drinking. Also, their hooves are ideal for walking on sand. Gold was the most precious commodity that was traded. It was very abundant in West Africa. Now, two reasons why gold is so valuable. One, it's pretty, and two, it's rare. Well, in West Africa, it wasn't really all that rare. Okay, so it was able to be traded for relatively low prices. For more than 700 years, this trans-Saharan trade route was used, and it brought considerable wealth to West Africa, shipping just tons and tons of gold out there. And the kingdoms that got exceptionally wealthy were Ghana and Mali. There's also a second trade route that was used called the Indian Ocean trade. You see that in the map right there along the East African coast. And this created the very thriving civilizations called the Swahili city-states, Swahili being the language they spoke there, city-states kind of like they had in ancient Greece. And some of them were Kilwa, Mombasa, and Zanzibar, okay, several of which are still cities today. And the East Africans also sold gold, but they also traded a lot of ivory and slaves to Muslim merchants. So I mentioned Ghana and Mali. First off, the Empire of Ghana, it sold gold and ivory to Muslim traders in exchange for salt, copper, cloth, and tools. One cool thing about trade is that you can trade something that you have an abundance of for something that you don't have anything of. And that way everyone really benefits. So Ghana became very wealthy, all right, but after a couple hundred years, it did kind of fade into obscurity, it died out, and then the Empire of Mali emerged. And Mali became just fabulously wealthy. It also sold gold and ivory, but what they did is they put tariffs on their imports, which is like a tax on trade, so they got even more money from the people they traded with. Mali's founder, their founding ruler, was a man named Sundiata, know his name. He was known as the Lion Prince, and he really cultivated a very thriving gold trade in Mali, and it was under his leadership that Mali grew incredibly wealthy. His grandnephew's name was Mansa Musa, and this is a name everyone should know. He ruled Mali in the 1300s. Many historians believe he was the richest man in all of history. All right, there are a handful of men who kind of compete for that title. There's Mansa Musa, Solomon, Nebuchadnezzar. Okay, but Mansa Musa was right up there as at least one of the most wealthy men in all of history. He was a Muslim, and he traveled to Egypt, so all across North Africa. Then he traveled to Mecca. Why would he travel to Mecca? Because every Muslim is supposed to, in their lifetime, to make a pilgrimage. That's their holy city. But he didn't stop there. He continued traveling to Constantinople, Russia, and India. And this caravan that he took with him contained 100 camels, thousands of slaves, soldiers, just tons of gold. And he basically wanted to show off all of his wealth, all of his property. Yes, sadly, human beings were considered property then. And he was able to kind of display the wealth of the Kingdom of Mali. And this expedition also really connected sub-Saharan Africa to a lot of the rest of the world. And Africa became much more influential on the world stage after Mansa Musa's expedition. Less than 100 years after Mansa Musa's death, the Kingdom of Mali declined, and it was replaced by the Songhai Empire, okay, the Songhai Kingdom. This was in the late 1400s that the Songhai Kingdom took its place as really the main powerhouse in West Africa. And through the same trading methods that Mali practiced, Songhai became even larger and richer than Mali was. Now, if you see the cities up there in the Songhai Empire, they were also in the Kingdom of Mali and Ghana. And that city, Timbuktu, right there. Okay, have you ever heard of people saying I'm going to all the way to Timbuktu, which means kind of in the middle of nowhere? Well, that was at the end of the Trans-Saharan trade route, so it was literally across 1,000 miles of desert, and that's where we get that phrase. Ibn Battuta, okay, a name we all need to know. Underline his name. He lived in the 1300s, and he was a Muslim scholar from Morocco, which is right here on the map, the northwestern coast of Africa, and he set out to really see the world that he had only read about. Okay, he wanted to take voyages all around the world, and that he did. Over 30 years, he traveled throughout essentially all of Asia and North Africa. You see him; he traveled along the coast. He traveled to sub-Saharan Africa, to the Kingdom of Mali, and all throughout the Middle East, India, China. Okay, even a little bit into Europe. And he kept a travel log and published it as a book after he was done. And this really provided people with just tons of detail about different places and different cultures that they had previously either not known had existed or didn't know anything about. So this is an example of globalization, right? Him seeing this entire landscape of Afro-Eurasia and writing about it for other people to learn about. He's very similar to a guy named Marco Polo, maybe you've heard of, but he was from Europe, and he went along the Silk Road to China and back. The two worst slave trades in human history were the Atlantic slave trade, which you probably know about. That's what brought slaves to the Americas. And the Arab slave trade. That one you might not know as much about. It's also known as the Islamic slave trade or the Arab slave trade. You can call it either one. Okay, those were the two worst slave trades in human history. The Arab slave trade lasted longer, but the Atlantic and Arab slave trade were equally cruel and brutal. Now, slavery in general had existed in Africa on a very large scale for thousands of years. In fact, nearly every tribe and civilization in the world had some system of slavery. The three types of people who were most often enslaved in Africa were prisoners of war, debtors, right, people who owed a debt to somebody and couldn't pay it off, and criminals. All right, prisoners of war, debtors, and criminals. Now, that is certainly bad. Okay, all types of slavery are bad, but there's a difference between putting or making someone a slave because they're a criminal or a prisoner of war versus capturing people from their land, forcing them into lifelong slavery in a faraway land, separating from their family. It's just a different kind of slavery. And then with the arrival of Islam and global trade in the 700s about, this sharply increased the amount of slavery in Africa and the number of slaves in Africa that would be shipped to other nations. So Muslim merchants imported millions of Africans from the Swahili city-states in East Africa, millions, over the course of several centuries. And these slaves were taken from their homes to the Middle East or to India in order to perform forced labor. Right? So this is a different kind of slavery called chattel slavery, literally because they're treated like cattle, treated like property. Okay, this kind of slavery is lifelong, whereas other forms of slavery used to be for just a set number of years. This also meant you had no rights, you were abused, and your children were born into slavery. Just an absolutely horrible system. Male slaves were used as agricultural workers or soldiers most of the time in the Arab slave trade, and then female slaves were also were often used as concubines, which is basically like a private prostitute, of course against their consent. This form of slavery, as I said, is called chattel slavery, and it is the worst kind of slavery. So the Arab slave trade existed for nearly 1,300 years. And sadly, slavery is still practiced in certain parts of the Middle East and Africa today. The Atlantic slave trade, which was equally brutal and inhumane, was abolished in the 1800s. So historians estimate that around 17 million African slaves were taken from East Africa in the Arab slave trade. 17 million souls were ripped from their home and shipped to a faraway land in the Middle East or India to be used as someone else's property, either for forced labor or sex or whatever. Okay, so just really horrible to think about, but also important to realize, because it makes us grateful for what we don't have to go through today. All right, so that covers medieval Africa in the Middle Ages. Let me know if you have any questions.